Hello, and welcome to the Biomass Magazine podcast. My name is Danielle Piekarski, and I am joined by editor of Biomass Magazine and Pellet Mill Magazine, our host Anna Simet, and Jason Kessler, the president and owner of KESCO. Good morning to you both, and Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Jason has been the president of KESCO for the past 21 years. His focus has been in dry bulk material particle reduction, product classification, densification, bulk material storage and handling, and dust collection and explosion mitigation. Jason has designed and built 9 complete wood pelleting plants and has provided portions to more than 30 pellet facilities. With years of expertise in customer-first business model, KESCO provides customers with affordable and efficient solutions. So let's hear more about that from Anna and Jason.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Jason, hello. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. It's always great to catch up with you and KESCO.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, I think we'll just jump right into things. Danielle gave you a nice introduction and told us a little bit about your background. Why don't we start by maybe you can explain to our listeners a little bit about why you founded KESCO.
Yeah, sure. Back in the 90s, I worked for a manufacturer of pellet mills, Bliss Industries, and was tasked with their systems, their wood processing systems business. And that included, particle board plants and wood flour processing plants, and then this new buzz called wood pelleting. And so that was in 1994, and people would call up and they would need a system. No one called up at that point and said, "Hey, I would like information on a pellet mill for wood pellets." They wanted a wood pelleting system. And so that's really where I started focusing my time, was in putting these systems together. And I don't know, it really tripped my trigger. I liked it. I liked the integration and the design and so on. And so in 2001, I decided to start KESCO, very much with kind of the same approach, working with many of the same vendors and suppliers that I had worked with previously at Bliss, but started, doing it on our own as a one-man show, handling the engineering and sales and support on my own, and that was just kind of the beginning of it. And so that's the background. I really enjoy the system work, and I really enjoy the biofuels industry specifically.
Mm-hmm. So how would you say KESCO is different from other equipment suppliers and engineering firms?
Well, I think it goes back to those roots, and that's, most equipment salespeople are selling a piece of equipment, and we very much look at a systematic sales approach. It's pretty rare that we just sell a one-off component. It's usually integrated into some type of a system or process. And what we saw years ago, there were many EPCs being asked to bring horsepower into these new projects in the biomass industry, and many of them, albeit very skilled, qualified engineers, weren't very familiar with that product, with the biomass products and wood pelleting in particular. And so what we found is that oftentimes these engineering firms were reaching out to the vendors themselves, the manufacturers, for the expertise. And that translated into a 18-month project schedule just for engineering services, and hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, in billable hours of engineering costs. We are not an engineering firm that sells engineering services as our product. Our incentive is to get do enough design and engineering to be able to put the system together the way the manufacturers want it put together, and to get it up and running successfully as quickly as possible. I think that's a big difference. Is where do we earn our living, and we earn our living when the customer is up and operational, being profitable, versus providing a package of engineering documents and an invoice for billable hours. That's the big difference.
Okay. So one thing that I've seen you promote, Jason, before, is that KESCO promotes looking at the entire system rather than looking at multiple islands. Can you talk about that concept and why you guys promote it?
Sure. Yep. And it's not isolated to the wood pelleting industry. It is all industries of processing dry bulk products. And that is, what's happening over here in the left hand may very well impact what's over here in the right hand. And so pellet plants were broken up into islands early on, in the 90s. That's how engineering firms started looking at them, probably just to delegate sections of a project to different teams. And what the byproduct of that view was that you ended up with, let's say, a very efficient dry hammer milling island in and of itself, but it didn't reflect what impact that maybe had on the pelleting process, or how the chipping process may affect the dry hammer milling process, and so on and so forth. And so, as is the case in all industries, we have to look at what's ahead of the process and what's behind the process as a whole, instead of just looking at individual islands, in order to really maximize an overall plant's efficiency.
Okay. Great answer, Jason. Thanks. One thing that you've said to me a while back that stood out is that oftentimes you try to explain the difference between price and cost to your clients. Can you elaborate a little bit about what that means in the context of pellet plant design?
Yeah, sure. It's and again, it's not just pellet plant design. It's industrial processing of all industries all the time. The best way I can describe it is, I subscribe to Biomass Magazine's digital publication. And if everyone else, if they aren't already, they should, because it's a lot of really good information. And there's an article in this past publication that references, it's talking about Enviva and their expansion. And one thing that really caught my eye in there was it was talking about their adjusted gross margin per metric ton for the second quarter of 22, and it was $42.94 per metric ton. And we're talking about a company that's looking at taking their total export from 6.2 million tons to 13 million tons over the next 5 years. I mean, if you do the math on that one, that $42.94 per ton, that's a big, big number. And so price versus cost is when you start looking at things that can maximize your process, like, I'm a firm believer that the most efficient line of process in the pelleting, in a pelleting plant, is to chip the product large enough that you can use a disc chipper instead of a drum chipper, so no microchips. But then take that material into green shredding to knock it down and to open up the fiber. That allows you to dry it more efficiently, and then it can be hammer milled more efficiently. And you see these benefits in horsepower savings and pellet mill production, going back to the whole island discussion. But when you start looking at, oh well, but if I add a green hammer milling or a green shredding island, it's a $5 million investment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. That's the price of it. But if it can get you an extra ton to 2 tons of production per hour on these large facilities, when you do the math on that $42.94 per ton gross margin, I mean, that $5 million becomes a drop in the bucket.
Right.
So when people are getting ready to write the checks, they look at $5 million and say, wow, that is a really big price.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the big picture, it's a really low cost.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on. You're out in the pellet world. What can you talk a little bit about any trends you're seeing when it comes to pellet plant design?
Yeah, I would say probably the biggest trends. I mean, it's a fairly new industry in the overall scheme of things. So trends is a loose term. I mean, it's, people are trying different things all the time to see where they can, be a little bit more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things that I'm seeing are driven by how do we improve our production, and other things are driven by variables like how do we decrease our emissions so that we can put more production in a given footprint.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the trends that I'm seeing are recycle systems on the air systems for the dry hammer milling island, or
Mm-hmm.
dry hammer mill line, depending on how it's all laid out. Bringing the air that's pulled through the hammer mill back to the inlet side of the hammer mill so that it decreases the emissions.
Mm-hmm.
That also addresses another trend that I'm seeing, which is, use the heat that's generated in that process
Mm-hmm.
to keep the material warm prior to the pellet mill. So now now to activate the lignins in the wood, you don't have to have all of that heat generation take place across the die. It's already kind of pre-warmed, if you will, coming into the pellet mill. Those are two of the, and I suppose the third thing would be, I'm seeing more and more water addition systems. So after people are drying the material further before the dry hammer mills, so that they can more efficiently dry hammer mill it to the specification.
Mm-hmm.
But then they're adding water back to the material before the pellet mills so that the pellet mills can be most efficient.
Interesting.
Just little tweaks here and there in the process. That's I don't know. That's one of the things I really, really love about this industry is it's
Mm-hmm.
cutting edge. People are learning new stuff all the time.
That's right. Right. Great answer, Jason. Is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you want to mention?
Oh, I suppose we could talk about wood pelleting. Maybe that makes me a dork. I don't know, but I could talk about it for hours and hours. And hours. I could bore you to death. No, but I think that touches on a lot of the key components. I think, at least in the processing end of the pellet world these days.
Yeah. Right. And so if any of our listeners are attending the USIPA Exporting Pellets Conference in Miami in October, could they find you?
Absolutely. In fact, what we're doing is is like we do at the Biomass show, which we'll be attending next year in Atlanta.
Excellent.
We bring our strategic partners, so our air system suppliers, our mechanical conveying suppliers, our explosion mitigation suppliers, our silo suppliers, and we have all of these key strategic partners with us, and they'll be with us at that event as well. So, that way we've got a representative from each piece of the process that makes up this system to be able to answer people's questions. It's proven to be a really good way to do these conferences and trade shows.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I certainly look forward to seeing you guys there. And, on behalf of Biomass Magazine, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast, Jason. It's been very interesting and enjoyable as always.
Thank you, Anna. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the rest of, I guess, the short little bit of your summer remaining before the kiddos go back to school.
Yeah, thanks so much. And to all of our listeners, make sure to watch for our next podcast. And if you're interested in joining us for an episode, please reach out. And we'll wrap up with that. Thanks so much for tuning in and have a great day.